The Grand Inquisitor by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Quite impossible, as you see, to start without an introduction, laughed Ivan. Well then, I mean to place the event described in the poem in the 16th century, an age, as you must have been told at school, when it was the great fashion among poets to make the denizens and powers of higher worlds descend on earth and mix freely with mortals. In France, all the notaries' clerks and the monks in the cloisters as well used to give grand performances, dramatic plays in which long scenes were enacted by the Madonna, the angels, the saints, Christ, and even by God himself. In those days, everything was very artless and primitive. An instance of it may be found in Victor Hugo's drama, Notre-Dame de Paris, where, at the Municipal Hall, a play called Le Bon Jugement de la Très Sainte et Gracieuse Vierge Marie is enacted in honor of Louis XV, in which the Virgin appears personally to pronounce her good judgment. In Moscow, during the Propitian period, performances of nearly the same character, chosen especially from the Old Testament, were also in great favor. Apart from such plays, the world was overflooded with mystical writings, verses, the heroes of which were always selected from the ranks of angels, saints, and other heavenly citizens, answering to the devotional purposes of the age. The recluses of our monasteries, like the Roman Catholic monks, passed their time in translating, copying, and even producing original compositions upon such subjects, and that remember during the Tartar period. In this connection, I am reminded of a poem compiled in a convent, a translation from the Greek, of course, called The Travels of the Mother of God Among the Damned, with fitting illustrations and a boldness of conception inferior nowise to that of Dante. The Mother of God visits hell, in company with the Archangel Michael as her cicerone to guide her through the legions of the damned. She sees them all, and is witness to their multifarious tortures. Among the many other exceedingly remarkably varieties of torments, every category of sinners having its own, there is one especially worthy of notice, namely a class of the damned, sentenced to gradually sink in a burning lake of brimstone and fire. Those whose sins cause them to sink so low that they no longer can rise to the surface are forever forgotten by God. That is, they fade out from the omniscient memory, says the poem, an expression, by the way, of an extraordinary profundity of thought when closely analyzed. The Virgin is terribly shocked, and falling down upon her knees in tears before the throne of God, begs that all she has seen in hell, all without exception, should have their sentences remitted to them. Her dialogue with God is colossally interesting. She supplicates she will not leave him. And when God, pointing to the pierced hands and feet of her Son, cries, "How can I forgive his executioners?" She then commands that all the saints, martyrs, angels, and archangels should prostrate themselves with her before the immutable and changeless one and implore him to change his wrath into mercy and forgive them all. The poem closes upon her obtaining from God a compromise, a kind of yearly respite of tortures between Good Friday and Trinity, a chorus of the damned singing loud praises to God from their bottomless pit, thanking and telling him, "Thou art right, O Lord, very right. Thou hast condemned us justly." My poem is of the same character. In it is Christ who appears on the scene. True, he says nothing, but only appears and passes out of sight. 15 centuries have elapsed since he left the world with the distinct promise to return with power and great glory. 15 long centuries since his prophet cried, "Prepare ye the way of the Lord." Since he himself had foretold, while yet on earth, of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But Christendom expects him still. It waits for him with the same old faith and the same emotion. Aye, with a far greater faith, for 15 centuries have rolled away since the last sign from heaven was sent to man, and blind faith remained alone, to lull the trusting heart, as heaven would send a sign no more. True, again, We have all heard of miracles being wrought ever since the age of miracles, passed away to return no more. We had, and still have, our saints credited with performing the most miraculous cures. And if we can believe their biographers, there have been those among them who have been personally visited by the Queen of Heaven. But Satan sleepeth not, and the first germs of doubt and ever-increasing unbelief in such wonders already had begun to sprout in Christendom as early as the 16th century. It was just at that time that a new and terrible heresy first made its appearance in the north of Germany. Luther's reform, a great star, shining as it were a lamp, fell upon the fountain's waters, and they were made bitter. This heresy blasphemously denied miracles. But those who had remained faithful believed all the more ardently. The tears of mankind ascended to him as heretofore, and the Christian world was expecting him as confidently as ever. They loved him and hoped in him, thirsted and hungered to suffer and die for him, just as many of them had done before. So many centuries had weak, trusting humanity implored him, crying with ardent faith and fervor, "How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not come?" So many long centuries hath it vainly appealed to him, that at last, in his inexhaustible compassion, he consenteth to answer the prayer. He decideth that once more, if it were but for one short hour, the people, his long-suffering, tortured, fatally sinful, his loving and childlike, trusting people, shall behold him again. The scene of action is placed by me in Spain, at Seville, during that terrible period of the Inquisition, when, for the greater glory of God, stakes were flaming all over the country, burning wicked heretics in grand auto-da-fés. This particular visit has, of course, nothing to do with the promised Advent, when, according to the program, after the tribulation of those days, he will appear coming in the clouds of heaven. For that coming of the Son of Man, as we are informed, will take place as suddenly as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even unto the west. No, this once he desired to come unknown and appear among his children, just when the bones of the heretics, sentenced to be burnt alive, had commenced crackling at the flaming stakes. Owing to his limitless mercy, he mixes once more with mortals, and in the same form in which he was wont to appear 15 centuries ago. He descends, just at the very moment when before king, courtiers, knights, cardinals, and the fairest dames of court, before the whole population of Seville, upwards of 100 wicked heretics are being roasted in a magnificent auto-da-fe ad majorem Dei gloriam by the order of the powerful Cardinal Grand Inquisitor. He comes silently and unannounced, yet all, how strange, yea, all recognize him at once. The population rushes towards him as if propelled by some irresistible force. It surrounds, throngs, and presses around. It follows him. Silently, and with a smile of boundless compassion upon his lips, he crosses the dense crowd and moves softly on. The sun of love burns in his heart, and warm rays of light, wisdom, and power beam forth from his eyes, and pour down their waves upon the swarming multitudes of the rabble assembled around, making their hearts vibrate with returning love. He extends his hands over their heads, blesses them, and from mere contact with him, aye, even with his garments, a healing power goes forth. An old man, blind from his birth, cries, "Lord, heal me that I may see thee." And the scales falling off the closed eyes, the blind man beholds him. The crowd weeps for joy and kisses the ground upon which he treads. Children strew flowers along his path and sing to him, "Hosanna." It is he, it is himself, they say to each other. It must be he. It can be none other but he. He pauses at the portal of the old cathedral, just as a wee white coffin is carried in, with tears and great lamentations. The lid is off, and in the coffin lies the body of a fair child, 7 years old, the only child of an eminent citizen of the city. The little corpse lies buried in flowers. "He will raise the child to life," confidently shouts the crowd to the weeping mother. The officiating priest who had come to meet the funeral procession looks perplexed and frowns. A loud cry is suddenly heard, and the bereaved mother prostrates herself at his feet. "If it be thou, then bring back my child to life," she cries beseechingly. The procession halts, and the little coffin is gently lowered at his feet. Divine compassion beams forth from his eyes, and as he looks at the child, his lips are heard to whisper once more, "Talitha cumi," and straightway the damsel arose. The child rises in her coffin. Her little hands still hold the nosegay of white roses, which after death was placed in them, and looking round with large, astonished eyes, she smiles sweetly. The crowd is violently excited. A terrible commotion rages among them. The populace shouts and loudly weeps, when suddenly, before the cathedral door, appears the Cardinal Grand Inquisitor himself. He is tall, gaunt-looking old man of nearly 80 years, with a stern, withered face and deeply sunken eyes, from the cavity of which glitter two fiery sparks. He has laid aside his gorgeous cardinal's robes, in which he had appeared before the people at the auto da fe of the enemies of the Romish Church, and is now clad in his old, rough, monkish cassock. His sullen assistants and slaves of the Holy Guard are following at a distance. He pauses before the crowd and observes. He has seen all. He has witnessed the placing of the little coffin at his feet, the calling back to life. And now his dark, grim face has grown still darker. His bushy grey eyebrows nearly meet, and his sunken eye flashes with sinister light. Slowly raising his finger, he commands his minions to arrest him. Such is his power over the well-disciplined, submissive, and now trembling people that the thick crowds immediately give way, and scattering before the guard, amid dead silence and without one breath of protest, allow them to lay their sacrilegious hands upon the stranger and lead him away. That same populace, like one man, now bows its head to the ground before the old Inquisitor, who blesses it and slowly moves onward. The guards conduct their prisoner to the ancient building of the Holy Tribunal. Pushing him into a narrow, gloomy, vaulted prison cell, they lock him in and retire. The day wanes, and night, a dark, hot, breathless Spanish night, creeps on and settles upon the city of Seville. The air smells of laurels and orange blossoms. In the Cimmerian darkness of the old tribunal hall, the iron door of the cell is suddenly thrown open, and the Grand Inquisitor, holding a dark lantern, slowly stalks into the dungeon. He is alone, and as the heavy door closes behind him, he pauses at the threshold, and for a minute or two silently and gloomily scrutinizes the face before him. At last, approaching with measured steps, he sets his lantern down upon the table and addresses him in these words, "It is thou! Thou!" Receiving no reply, he rapidly continues, "Nay, answer not. Be silent. And what couldst thou say? I know but too well thy answer. Besides, thou hast no right to add one syllable to that which was already uttered by thee before. Why shouldst thou now return, to impede us in our work? For thou hast come but for that only, and thou knowest it well. But art thou as well aware of what awaits thee in the morning? I do not know, nor do I care to know who thou mayest be it thou or only thine image. Tomorrow I will condemn and burn thee on the stake as the most wicked of all the heretics. And that same people who today were kissing thy feet, tomorrow at one bend of my finger will rush to add fuel to thy funeral pile. Wert thou aware of this?" he adds, speaking as if in solemn thought, and never for one instant taking his piercing glance off the meek face before him. "I can hardly realize the situation described. What is all this, Ivan?" Suddenly interrupted Alyosha, who had remained silently listening to his brother. "Is this an extravagant fancy, or some mistake of the old man, an impossible quid pro quo?" "Let it be the latter, if you like," laughed Ivan, "since modern realism has so perverted your taste that you feel unable to realize anything from the world of fancy. Let it be a quid pro quo if you so choose it. Again, the Inquisitor is 90 years old, and he might have easily gone mad with his one-ID fix of power, or it might have as well been a delirious vision, called forth by dying fancy, overheated by the auto-da-fe of the 100 heretics in that forenoon. But what matters for the poem whether it was a quid pro quo or an uncontrollable fancy? The question is that the old man has to open his heart, that he must give out his thought at last, and that the hour has come when he does speak it out, and says loudly that which for 90 years he has kept secret within his own breast. And his prisoner, does he never reply? Does he keep silent, looking at him without saying a word? Of course, and it could not well be otherwise, again retorted Ivan. The Grand Inquisitor begins from his very first words by telling him that he has no right to add one syllable to that which he had said before. To make the situation clear at once, the above preliminary monologue is intended to convey to the reader the very fundamental idea which underlies Roman Catholicism. As well as I can convey it, his words mean, in short, everything was given over by thee to the Pope, and everything now rests with him alone. Thou hast no business to return, and thus hinder us in our work. In this sense, the Jesuits not only talk, but write likewise. Hast thou the right to divulge to us a single one of the mysteries of that world whence thou comest? Inquires of him my old Inquisitor, and forthwith answers for him. Nay, thou hast no such right, for that would be adding to that which was already said by thee before, hence depriving people of that freedom for which thou hast so stoutly stood up while yet on earth. Anything new that thou would now proclaim would have to be regarded as an attempt to interfere with that freedom of choice, as it would come as a new and a miraculous revelation, superseding the old revelation of 1500 years ago, when thou didst so repeatedly tell the people, "The truth shall make you free." Behold, then, thy free people now, adds the old man with sombre irony. Yea, it has cost us dearly, he continues, sternly looking at his victim. But we have at last accomplished our task, and in thy name. For 15 long centuries we had to toil and suffer, owing to that freedom. But now we have prevailed, and our work is done, and well and strongly it is done. Believest not thou it is so very strong? And why should thou look at me so meekly, as if I were not worthy even of thy indignation? Know then that now, and only now, thy people feel fully sure and satisfied of their freedom, and that only since they have themselves, and of their own free will, delivered that freedom unto our hands by placing it submissively at our feet. But then, that is what we have done. Is it that which thou hast striven for? Is this the kind of freedom thou hast promised them? Now again, I do not understand, interrupted Alyosha. Does the old man mock and laugh? Not in the least. He seriously regards it as a great service done by himself, his brother monks and Jesuits, to humanity, to have conquered and subjected unto their authority that freedom, and boasts that it was done but for the good of the world. For only now, he says, speaking of the Inquisition, has it become possible to us, for the first time, to give a serious thought to human happiness. Man is born a rebel, and can rebels be ever happy? Thou hast been fairly warned of it, but evidently to no use, since thou hast rejected the only means which could make mankind happy. Fortunately, at thy departure, thou hast delivered the task to us. Thou hast promised, ratifying the pledge by thy own words, in words giving us the right to bind and unbind. And surely thou couldst not think of depriving us of it now. But what can he mean by the words, "Thou hast been fairly warned"? Asked Alexis. These words give the key to what the old man has to say for his justification. But listen, the terrible and wise spirit, the spirit of self-annihilation and non-being, goes on the Inquisitor. The great spirit of negation conversed with thee in the wilderness, and we are told that he tempted thee. Was it so? And if it were so, then it is impossible to utter anything more truthful than what is contained in his three offers, which thou didst reject, and which are usually called temptations. Yea, if ever there was on earth a genuine striking wonder produced, it was on that day of thy three temptations, and it is precisely in these three short sentences that the marvelous miracle is contained. If it were possible that they should vanish and disappear forever without leaving any trace from the record and from the memory of man, and that it should become necessary again to devise, invent, and make them reappear in thy history once more, thinkest thou that all the world's sages, all the legislators, initiates, philosophers, and thinkers, if called upon to frame three questions which should, like these, besides answering the magnitude of the event, express in three short sentences the whole future history of this our world and of mankind. Dost thou believe, I ask thee, that all their combined efforts could ever create anything equal in power and depth of thought to the three propositions offered thee by the powerful and all-wise Spirit in the wilderness? Judging of them by their marvelous aptness alone, one can at once perceive that they emanated not from a finite, terrestrial intellect, but indeed from the eternal and the absolute. In these three offers we find, blended into one and foretold to us, the complete subsequent history of man. We are shown three images, so to say, uniting in them all the future axiomatic, insoluble problems and contradictions of human nature, the world over. In those days, the wondrous wisdom contained in them was not made so apparent as it is now, for futurity remained still veiled. But now, when 15 centuries have elapsed, we see that everything in these three questions is so marvelously foreseen and foretold that to add to, or to take away from, the prophecy one jot would be absolutely impossible. Decide then thyself, sternly proceeded the Inquisitor, which of ye twain was right, thou who didst reject, or he who offered? Remember the subtle meaning of question the first, which runs thus: Wouldst thou go into the world empty-handed? Would thou venture thither with thy vague and undefined promise of freedom, which men, dull and unruly as they are by nature, are unable so much as to understand, which they avoid and fear? For never was there anything more unbearable to the human race than personal freedom. Dost thou see these stones in the desolate and glaring wilderness? Command that these stones be made bread, and mankind will run after thee, obedient and grateful like a herd of cattle. But even then it will be ever diffident and trembling, lest thou should take away thy hand, and they lose thereby their bread. Thou didst refuse to accept the offer for fear of depriving men of their free choice. For where is their freedom of choice, where men are bribed with bread? Man shall not live by bread alone, was thine answer. Thou knewest not, it seems, that it was precisely in the name of that earthly bread that the terrestrial spirit would one day rise against, struggle with, and finally conquer thee, followed by the hungry multitudes shouting, Who is like unto that beast, who maketh fire come down from heaven upon the earth? Knowest thou not that, but a few centuries hence, and the whole of mankind will have proclaimed in its wisdom, and through its mouthpiece, science, that there is no more crime, hence no more sin on earth, but only hungry people? Feed us first, and then command us to be virtuous, will be the words written upon the banner lifted against thee, a banner which shall destroy thy church to its very foundations, and in the place of thy temple shall raise once more the terrible Tower of Babel. And though its building be left unfinished, as was that of the first one, yet the fact will remain recorded that thou couldst, but wouldst not, prevent the attempt to build that new tower by accepting the offer, and thus saving mankind a millennium of useless suffering on earth. And it is to us that the people will return again. They will search for us catacombs, as we shall once more be persecuted and martyred, and they will begin crying unto us, Feed us, for they who promised us the fire from heaven have deceived us. It is then that we will finish building their tower for them, for they alone who feed them shall finish it, and we shall feed them in thy name, and lying to them, that it is in that name. Oh, never, never will they learn to feed themselves without our help. No science will ever give them bread so long as they remain free, so long as they refuse to lay that freedom at our feet and say, "Enslave, but feed us." That day must come when men will understand that freedom and daily bread enough to satisfy all are unthinkable and can never be had together, as men will never be able to fairly divide the two among themselves. And they will also learn that they can never be free, for they are weak, vicious, miserable non-entities born wicked and rebellious. Thou hast promised to them the bread of life, the bread of heaven. But I ask thee again, can that bread ever equal in the sight of the weak and the vicious, the ever ungrateful human race, their daily bread on earth? And even supposing that thousands and tens of thousands follow thee in the name of, and for the sake of, thy heavenly bread, what will become of the millions and hundreds of millions of human beings too weak to scorn the earthly for the sake of thy heavenly bread? Or is it but those tens of thousands chosen among the great and the mighty that are so dear to thee, while the remaining millions, innumerable as the grains of sand in the seas, the weak and the loving, have to be used as material for the former? No, no. In our sight, and for our purpose, the weak and the lowly are the more dear to us. True, they are vicious and rebellious, but we will force them into obedience, and it is they who will admire us the most. They will regard us as gods and feel grateful to those who have consented to lead the masses and bear their burden of freedom by ruling over them. So terrible will that freedom at last appear to men. Then we will tell them that it is in obedience to thy will and in thy name that we rule over them. We will deceive them once more and lie to them once again, for never, never more will we allow thee to come among us. In this deception we will find our suffering, for we must needs lie eternally and never cease to lie. Such is the secret meaning of temptation the first, and that is what thou didst reject in the wilderness for the sake of that freedom which thou didst prize above all. Meanwhile, thy tempter's offer contained another great world mystery. By accepting the bread, thou wouldst have satisfied and answered a universal craving, a ceaseless longing alive in the heart of every individual human being, lurking in the breast of collective mankind, that most perplexing problem: whom or what shall we worship? There exists no greater or more painful anxiety for a man who has freed himself from all religious bias than how he shall soonest find a new object or idea to worship. But man seeks to bow before that only which is recognized by the greater majority, if not by all his fellow men, as having a right to be worshipped, whose rights are so unquestionable that men agree unanimously to bow down to it. For the chief concern of these miserable creatures is not to find and worship the idol of their own choice, but to discover that which all others will believe in and consent to bow down to in a mass. It is that instinctive need of having a worship in common that is the chief suffering of every man, the chief concern of mankind from the beginning of times. It is for that universality of religious worship that people destroyed each other by sword. Creating gods unto themselves, they forthwith began appealing to each other. Abandon your deities, come and bow down to ours, or death to ye and your idols. And so will they do till the end of this world. They will do so even then, when all the gods themselves have disappeared. For then men will prostrate themselves before and worship some idea. Thou didst know, thou couldst not be ignorant of, that mysterious fundamental principle in human nature, and still thou hast rejected the only absolute banner offered thee, to which all the nations would remain true, and before which all would have bowed, the banner of earthly bread, rejected in the name of freedom, and of bread in the kingdom of God. Behold, then, what thou hast done furthermore for that freedom's sake. I repeat to thee, man has no greater anxiety in life than to find someone to whom he can make over that gift of freedom with which the unfortunate creature is born. But he alone will prove capable of silencing and quieting their consciences, that shall succeed in possessing himself of the freedom of men. With daily bread, an irresistible power was offered thee. Show a man bread, and he will follow thee. For what can he resist less than the attraction of bread? But if, at the same time, another succeed in possessing himself of his conscience, oh, then even thy bread will be forgotten, and man will follow him who seduced his conscience. So far thou wert right. For the mystery of human being does not solely rest in the desire to live, but in the problem. For what should one live at all? Without a clear perception of his reasons for living, man will never consent to live, and will rather destroy himself than tarry on earth, though he be surrounded with bread. This is the truth. But what has happened? Instead of getting hold of man's freedom, thou hast enlarged it still more. Hast thou again forgotten that to man rest and even death are preferable to a free choice between the knowledge of good and evil? Nothing seems more seductive in his eyes than freedom of conscience, and nothing proves more painful. And behold, instead of laying a firm foundation whereon to rest once for all man's conscience, thou hast chosen to stir up in him all that is abnormal, mysterious, and indefinite, all that is beyond human strength, and has acted as if thou never hadst any love for him, and yet thou wert he who came to lay down his life for his friends. Thou hast burdened man's soul with anxieties hitherto unknown to him, thirsting for human love freely given, seeking to enable man, seduced and charmed by thee, to follow thy path of his own free will, instead of the old and wise law which held him in subjection. Thou hast given him the right henceforth to choose, and freely decide what is good and bad for him, guided but by thine image in his heart. But hast thou never dreamt of the probability, nay, of the certainty, of that same man one day rejected finally, and controverting even thine image and thy truth, once he would find himself laden with such a terrible burden as freedom of choice? That a time would surely come when men would exclaim that truth and light cannot be in thee, for no one could have left them in a greater perplexity and mental suffering than thou hast done, lading them with so many cares and insoluble problems. Thus, it is thyself who hast laid the foundation for the destruction of thine own kingdom, and no one but thou is to be blamed for it. Meantime, every chance of success was offered thee. There are three powers, three unique forces upon earth, capable of conquering forever by charming the conscience of these weak rebels, men for their own good. And these forces are miracle, mystery, and authority. Thou hast rejected all the three, and thus wert the first to set them an example. When the terrible and all-wise Spirit placed thee on a pinnacle of the temple, and said unto thee, If thou be the Son of God, cast thyself down, for it is written, He shall give his angels charge concerning thee, and in their hands they shall bear thee up, lest at any time thou dash thy foot against a stone. For thus thy faith in thy Father should have been made evident. Thou didst refuse to accept his suggestion, and didst not follow it. Oh, undoubtedly, thou didst act in this with all the magnificent pride of a god, but then men, that weak and rebel race, are they also gods, to understand thy refusal? Of course, thou didst well know that by taking one single step forward, by making the slightest motion to throw thyself down, thou wouldst have tempted the Lord thy God, lost suddenly all faith in him, and dashed thyself to atoms against that same earth which thou camest to save, and thus wouldst have allowed the wise spirit which tempted thee to triumph and rejoice. But then, how many such as thee are to be found on this globe? I ask thee. Couldst thou ever for a moment imagine that men would have the same strength to resist such a temptation? Is human nature calculated to reject miracle and trust during the most terrible moments in life, when the most momentous, painful, and perplexing problems struggle within man's soul to the free decisions of his heart for the true solution? Oh, thou knewest well that that action of thine would remain recorded in books for ages to come, reaching to the confines of the globe, and thy hope was that, following thy example, man would remain true to his God, without needing any miracle to keep his faith alive. But thou knewest not, it seems, that no sooner would man reject miracle than he would reject God likewise, for he seeketh less God than a sign from him. And thus, as it is beyond the power of man to remain without miracles, so rather than live without, he will create for himself new wonders of his own making, and he will bow to and worship the soothsayer's miracles, the old witch's sorcery, were he a rebel, a heretic, and an atheist 100 times over. Thy refusal to come down from the cross when people, mocking and wagging their heads, were saying to thee, "Save thyself, if thou be the Son of God, and we will believe in thee," was due to the same determination, not to enslave man through miracle, but to obtain faith in thee freely and apart from any miraculous influence. Thou thirstest for free and uninfluenced love, and refuses the passionate adoration of the slave before a potency which would have subjected his will once forever. Thou judgest of men too highly here again, for though rebels they be, they are born slaves, and nothing more. Behold, and judge of them once more, now that 15 centuries have elapsed since that moment. Look at them, whom thou didst try to elevate unto thee. I swear man is weaker and lower than thou hast ever imagined him to be. Can he ever do that which thou art said to have accomplished? By valuing him so highly, thou hast acted as if there were no love for him in thine heart, for thou hast demanded of him more than he could ever give, thou who lovest him more than thyself. Hadst thou esteemed him less, less wouldst thou have demanded of him, and that would have been more like love, for his burden would have been made thereby lighter. Man is weak and cowardly. What matters it, if he now riots and rebels throughout the world against our will and power, and prides himself upon that rebellion? It is but the petty pride and vanity of a schoolboy. It is the rioting of little children, getting up a mutiny in the classroom and driving their schoolmaster out of it. But it will not last long, and when the day of their triumph is over, they will have to pay dearly for it. They will destroy the temples and raze them to the ground, flooding the earth with blood. But the foolish children will have to learn some day that, rebels though they be and riotous from nature, they are too weak to maintain the spirit of mutiny for any length of time. Suffused with idiotic tears, they will confess that he who created them rebellious undoubtedly did so, but to mock them. They will pronounce these words in despair, and such blasphemous utterances will but add to their misery, for human nature cannot endure blasphemy, and takes her own revenge in the end. And thus, after all thou hast suffered for mankind and its freedom, the present fate of men may be summed up in 3 words: unrest, confusion, misery. Thy great prophet John records in his vision that he saw, during the first resurrection of the chosen servants of God, the number of them which were sealed in their foreheads, 12,000 of every tribe. But were they indeed as many? Then they must have been gods, not men. They had shared thy cross for long years, suffered scores of years' hunger and thirst in dreary wildernesses and deserts, feeding upon locusts and roots, and of these children of free love for thee and self-sacrifice in thy name thou mayest well feel proud. But remember that these are but a few thousands, of gods, not men, and how about all others? And why should the weakest be held guilty for not being able to endure what the strongest have endured? Why should a soul incapable of containing such terrible gifts be punished for its weakness? Didst thou really come to, and for, the elect alone? If so, then the mystery will remain forever mysterious to our finite minds. And if a mystery, then were we right to proclaim it as one and preach it, teaching them that neither their freely given love to thee nor freedom of conscience were essential, but only that incomprehensible mystery which they must blindly obey even against the dictates of their conscience. Thus did we. We corrected and improved thy teaching and based it upon miracle, mystery, and authority. And men rejoiced at finding themselves led once more like a herd of cattle, and at finding their hearts at last delivered of the terrible burden laid upon them by thee, which caused them so much suffering. Tell me, were we right in doing as we did? Did not we show our great love for humanity by realizing in such a humble spirit its helplessness, by so mercifully lightening its great burden, and by permitting and remitting for its weak nature every sin, provided it be committed with our authorization? For what, then, hast thou come again to trouble us in our work? And why lookest thou at me so penetratingly with thy meek eyes, and in such a silence? Rather shouldst thou feel wrath, for I need not thy love. I reject it, and love thee not myself. Why should I conceal the truth from thee? I know but too well with whom I am now talking. What I had to say was known to thee before. I read it in thine eye. How should I conceal from thee our secret? If perchance thou wouldst hear it from my own lips, then listen. We are not with thee, but with him, and that is our secret. For centuries have we abandoned thee to follow him. Yes, 8 centuries. 800 years now since we accepted from him the gift rejected by thee with indignation. That last gift which he offered thee from the high mountain, when, showing all the kingdoms of the world and the glory of them, he saith unto thee, All these things will I give thee, if thou wilt fall down and worship me. We took Rome from him, and the glaive of Caesar, and declared ourselves alone the kings of this earth, its sole kings, though our work is not yet fully accomplished. But who is to blame for it? Our work is but in its incipient stage, but it is nevertheless started. We may have long to wait until its culmination, and mankind have to suffer much, but we shall reach the goal some day, and become sole Caesars, and then will be the time to think of universal happiness for men. Thou couldst accept the glaive of Caesar thyself. Why didst thou reject the offer? By accepting from the powerful spirit his third offer, thou would have realized every aspiration man seeketh for himself on earth. Man would have found a constant object for worship, one to deliver his conscience up to, and one that should unite all together into one common and harmonious ant-hill. For an innate necessity for universal union constitutes the third and final affliction of mankind. Humanity as a whole has ever aspired to unite itself universally. Many were the great nations with great histories, but the greater they were, the more unhappy they felt, as they felt the stronger necessity of a universal union among men. Great conquerors like Timur and Chenghis Khan passed like a cyclone upon the face of the earth in their efforts to conquer the universe, but even they, albeit unconsciously, expressed the same aspiration towards universal and common union. In accepting the kingdom of the world and Caesar's purple, one would found a universal kingdom and secure to mankind eternal peace. And who can rule mankind better than those who have possessed themselves of man's conscience and hold in their hand man's daily bread? Having accepted Caesar's glaive and purple, we had, of course, but to deny thee, to henceforth follow him alone. Oh, centuries of intellectual riot and rebellious free thought are yet before us, and their science will end by anthropophagy, for having begun to build their Babylonian tower without our help, they will have to end by anthropophagy. But it is precisely at that time that the beast will crawl up to us in full submission and lick the soles of our feet and sprinkle them with tears of blood. And we shall sit upon the scarlet-colored beast, and lifting up high the golden cup, full of abomination and filthiness, shall show written upon it the word mystery. But it is only then that men will see the beginning of a kingdom of peace and happiness. Thou art proud of thine own elect, but thou hast none other but these elect, and we will give rest to all. But that is not the end. Many are those among thine elect and the labourers of thy vineyard, who, tired of waiting for thy coming, already have carried and will yet carry the great fervour of their hearts and their spiritual strength into another field, and will end by lifting up against thee thine own banner of freedom. But it is thyself thou hast to thank. Under our rule and sway all will be happy, and will neither rebel nor destroy each other as they did while under thy free banner. Oh, we will take good care to prove to them that they will become absolutely free only when they have abjured their freedom in our favor and submit to us absolutely. Thinkest thou we shall be right or still lying? They will convince themselves of our rightness, for they will see what a depth of degrading slavery and strife that liberty of thine has led them into. Liberty, freedom of thought and conscience, and science will lead them into such impassable chasms, place them face to face before such wonders and insoluble mysteries, that some of them, more rebellious and ferocious than the rest, will destroy themselves. Others, rebellious but weak, will destroy each other, while the remainder, weak, helpless, and miserable, will crawl back to our feet and cry, "Yes, right were ye, O fathers of Jesus. Ye alone are in possession of his mystery, and we return to you, praying that ye save us from ourselves." Receiving their bread from us, they will clearly see that we take the bread from them, the bread made by their own hands, but to give it back to them in equal shares, and that without any miracle. And having ascertained that, though we have not changed stones into bread, yet bread they have, while every other bread turned verily in their own hands into stones, they will be only too glad to have it so. Until that day, they will never be happy. And who is it that helped the most to blind them? Tell me, who separated the flock and scattered it over ways unknown, if it be not thee? But we will gather the sheep once more and subject them to our will forever. We will prove to them their own weakness and make them humble again, whilst with thee they have learnt but pride, for thou hast made more of them than they ever were worth. We will give them that quiet, humble happiness, which alone benefits such weak, foolish creatures as they are, and having once had proved to them their weakness, they will become timid and obedient, and gather around us as chickens around their hen. They will wonder at and feel a superstitious admiration for us, and feel proud to be led by men so powerful and wise that a handful of them can subject a flock 1,000,000,000 strong. Gradually, men will begin to fear us. They will nervously dread our slightest anger. Their intellects will weaken. Their eyes become as easily accessible to tears as those of children and women. But we will teach them an easy transition from grief and tears to laughter, childish joy and mirthful song. Yes, we will make them work like slaves, but during their recreation hours they shall have an innocent, childlike life, full of play and merry laughter. We will even permit them sin, for weak and helpless, they will feel the more love for us for permitting them to indulge in it. We will tell them that every kind of sin will be remitted to them, so long as it is done with our permission, that we take all these sins upon ourselves, for we so love the world that we are even willing to sacrifice our souls for its satisfaction. And appearing before them in the light of their scapegoats and redeemers, we shall be adored the more for it. They will have no secrets from us. It will rest with us to permit them to live with their wives and concubines, or to forbid them to have children or remain childless, either way depending on the degree of their obedience to us. And they will submit most joyfully to us the most agonizing secrets of their souls. All, all will they lay down at our feet, and we will authorize and remit them all in thy name, and they will believe us and accept our mediation with rapture, as it will deliver them from their greatest anxiety and torture, that of having to decide freely for themselves. And all will be happy, all except the 100,000 or 200,000 of their rulers. For it is but we the keepers of the great mystery, who will be miserable. There will be thousands of millions of happy infants and 100,000 martyrs who have taken upon themselves the curse of knowledge of good and evil. Peaceable will be their end, and peacefully will they die in thy name, to find behind the portals of the grave, but death. But we will keep the secret inviolate, and deceive them for their own good, with the mirage of life eternal in thy kingdom. For, were there really anything like life beyond the grave, surely it would never fall to the lot of such as they. People tell us and prophesy of thy coming and triumphing once more on earth, of thy appearing with the army of thy elect, with thy proud and mighty ones. But we will answer thee that they have saved but themselves, while we have saved all. We are also threatened with the great disgrace which awaits the whore, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, who sits upon the beast, holding in her hands the mystery, the word written upon her forehead. And we are told that the weak ones, the lambs, shall rebel against her, and shall make her desolate and naked. But then will I arise, and point out to thee the thousands of millions of happy infants free from any sin. And we who have taken their sins upon us for their own good shall stand before thee and say, Judge us, if thou canst and darest. Know then that I fear thee not. Know that I too have lived in the dreary wilderness, where I fed upon locusts and roots, that I too have blessed freedom with which thou hast blessed men, and that I too have once prepared to join the ranks of thy elect, the proud and the mighty. But I awoke from my delusion, and refused since then to serve insanity. I returned to join the legion of those who corrected thy mistakes. I left the proud, and returned to the really humble, and for their own happiness. What I now tell thee will come to pass, and our kingdom shall be built. I tell thee not later than tomorrow thou shalt see that obedient flock which at one simple motion of my hand will rush to add burning coals to thy stake, on which I will burn thee for having dared to come and trouble us in our work. For if there ever was one who deserved more than any of the others our inquisitorial fires, it is thee. Tomorrow I will burn thee. Dixie. Ivan paused. He had entered into the situation and had spoken with great animation, but now he suddenly burst out laughing. "But all that is absurd," suddenly exclaimed Alyosha, who had hitherto listened perplexed and agitated, but in profound silence. "Your poem is a glorification of Christ, not an accusation, as you, perhaps, meant to be. And who will believe you when you speak of freedom? Is it thus that we Christians must understand it? It is Rome, not all Rome, for that would be unjust, but the worst of the Roman Catholics, the Inquisitors and Jesuits that you have been exposing. Your Inquisitor is an impossible character. What are these sins they are taking upon themselves? Who are those keepers of mystery who took upon themselves a curse for the good of mankind? Who ever met them? We all know the Jesuits, and no one has a good word to say in their favor. But when were they as you depict them? Never, never. The Jesuits are merely a Romish army making ready for their future temporal kingdom with a mitred emperor, a Roman high priest at their head. That is their ideal and object, without any mystery or elevated suffering. The most prosaic thirsting for power, for the sake of the mean and earthly pleasures of life, a desire to enslave their fellow men, something like our late system of serfs, with themselves at the head as landed proprietors. That is all that they can be accused of. They may not believe in God, that is also possible, but your suffering Inquisitor is simply a fancy. Hold, hold, interrupted Ivan, smiling. Do not be so excited. A fancy, you say? Be it so. Of course, it is a fancy. But stop. Do you really imagine that all this Catholic movement during the last centuries is naught but a desire for power for the mere purpose of mean pleasures? Is this what your father, Pacey, taught you? No, no, quite the reverse. For Father Pacey once told me something very similar to what you yourself say, though, of course, not that. Something quite different, suddenly added Alexis, blushing. A precious piece of information, notwithstanding your not that. I ask you, why should the Inquisitors and the Jesuits of your imagination live but for the attainment of mean material pleasures? Why should there not be found among them one single genuine martyr suffering under a great and holy idea and loving humanity with all his heart? Now let us suppose that among all these Jesuits, thirsting and hungering, but after mean material pleasures, there may be one, just one, like my old Inquisitor, who had himself fed upon roots in the wilderness, suffered the tortures of damnation while trying to conquer flesh, in order to become free and perfect, but who had never ceased to love humanity, and who one day prophetically beheld the truth, who saw as plain as he could see that the bulk of humanity could never be happy under the old system, that it was not for them that the great idealist had come and died and dreamt of his universal harmony. Having realized that truth, he returned into the world and joined intelligent and practical people. Is this so impossible? Joined whom? What intelligent and practical people? Exclaimed Alyosha, quite excited. Why should they be more intelligent than other men? And what secrets and mysteries can they have? They have neither. Atheism and infidelity is all the secret they have. Your Inquisitor does not believe in God, and that is all the mystery there is in it. It may be so. You have guessed rightly there. And it is so, and that is his whole secret. But is this not the acutest sufferings for such a man as he, who killed all his young life in asceticism in the desert, and yet could not cure himself of his love towards his fellowmen? Toward the end of his life, he becomes convinced that it is only by following the advice of the great and terrible spirit that the fate of these millions of weak rebels, these half-finished samples of humanity created in mockery, can be made tolerable. And once convinced of it, he sees as clearly that to achieve that object, one must follow blindly the guidance of the wise spirit, the fearful spirit of death and destruction. Hence, accept a system of lies and deception and lead humanity consciously this time toward death and destruction, and moreover, be deceiving them all the while in order to prevent them from realizing where they are being led, and so force the miserable blind men to feel happy, at least while here on earth. And note this, a wholesale deception in the name of him, in whose ideal the old man had so passionately, so fervently believed during nearly his whole life. Is this no suffering? And were such a solitary exception found amidst, and at the head of, that army that thirsts for power, but for the sake of the mean pleasures of life? Think you one such man would not suffice to bring on a tragedy? Moreover, one single man like my Inquisitor as a principal leader would prove sufficient to discover the real guiding idea of the Romish system with all its armies of Jesuits, the greatest and chiefest conviction that the solitary type described in my poem has at no time ever disappeared from among the chief leaders of that movement. Who knows but that terrible old man, loving humanity so stubbornly and in such an original way, exists even in our days in the shape of a whole host of such solitary exceptions, whose existence is not due to mere chance, but to a well-defined association born of mutual consent, to a secret league, organized several centuries back, in order to guard the mystery from the indiscreet eyes of the miserable and weak people, and only in view of their own happiness. And so it is. It cannot be otherwise. I suspect that even Masons have some such mystery underlying the basis of their organization, and that it is just the reason why the Roman Catholic clergy hate them so, dreading to find in them rivals, competition, the dismemberment of the unity of the idea, for the realization of which one flock and one shepherd are needed. However, in defending my idea, I look like an author whose production is unable to stand criticism. Enough of this. You are, perhaps, a Mason yourself, exclaimed Alyosha. You do not believe in God, he added, with a note of profound sadness in his voice. But suddenly remarking that his brother was looking at him with mockery, how do you mean then to bring your poem to a close? He unexpectedly inquired, casting his eyes downward. Or does it break off here? My intention is to end it with the following scene. Having disburdened his heart, the Inquisitor waits for some time to hear his prisoner speak in his turn. His silence weighs upon him. He has seen that his captive has been attentively listening to him all the time, with his eyes fixed penetratingly and softly on the face of his jailer, and evidently bent upon not replying to him. The old man longs to hear his voice, to hear him reply, better words of bitterness and scorn than his silence. Suddenly he rises. Slowly and silently approaching the Inquisitor, he bends towards him and softly kisses the bloodless 80-and-10-year-old lips. That is all the answer. The Grand Inquisitor shudders. There is a convulsive twitch at the corner of his mouth. He goes to the door, opens it, and addressing him, "Go," he says, "go, and return no more. Do not come again, never, never," and lets him out into the dark night. The prisoner vanishes. And the old man? The kiss burns his heart, but the old man remains firm in his own ideas and unbelief. "And you, together with him? You too," despairingly exclaimed Alyosha, while Ivan burst into a still louder fit of laughter. Lazarus, by Leonid Andreyev. 1. When Lazarus rose from the grave, after 3 days and nights in the mysterious thraldom of death, and returned alive to his home, it was a long time before anyone noticed the evil peculiarities in him that were later to make his very name terrible. His friends and relatives were jubilant that he had come back to life. They surrounded him with tenderness. They were lavish of their eager attentions, spending the greatest care upon his food and drink and the new garments they made for him. They clad him gorgeously in the glowing colours of hope and laughter, and when, arrayed like a bridegroom, he sat at table with them again, ate again, and drank again, they wept fondly and summoned the neighbours to look upon the man miraculously raised from the dead. The neighbours came and were moved with joy. Strangers arrived from distant cities and villages to worship the miracle. They burst into stormy exclamations and buzzed around the house of Mary and Martha like so many bees. That which was new in Lazarus's face and gestures they explained naturally as the traces of his severe illness and the shock he had passed through. It was evident that the disintegration of the body had been halted by a miraculous power, but that the restoration had not been complete, that death had left upon his face and body the effect of an artist's unfinished sketch seen through a thin glass. On his temples, under his eyes, and in the hollow of his cheek lay a thick, earthy blue. His fingers were blue too, and under his nails, which had grown long in the grave, the blue had turned livid. Here and there on his lips and body, the skin, blistered in the grave, had burst open and left reddish, glistening cracks, as if covered with a thin, glassy slime, and he had grown exceedingly stout. His body was horribly bloated and suggested the fetid, damp smell of putrefaction. But the cadaverous, heavy odour that clung to his burial garments, and as it seemed to his very body, soon wore off, and after some time the blue of his hands and face softened, and the reddish cracks of his skin smoothed out, though they never disappeared completely. Such was the aspect of Lazarus in his second life. It looked natural only to those who had seen him buried. Not merely Lazarus's face, but his very character, it seemed, had changed, though it astonished no one and did not attract the attention it deserved. Before his death, Lazarus had been cheerful and careless, a lover of laughter and harmless jest. It was because of his good humour, pleasant and equable, his freedom from meanness and gloom, that he had been so beloved by the master. Now he was grave and silent. Neither he himself jested, nor did he laugh at the jests of others, and the words he spoke occasionally were simple, ordinary and necessary words, words as much devoid of sense and depth as are the sounds with which an animal expresses pain and pleasure, thirst and hunger. Such words a man may speak all his life, and no one would ever know the sorrows and joys that dwelt within him. Thus it was that Lazarus sat at the festive table among his friends and relatives, his face the face of a corpse over which, for 3 days, death had reigned in darkness, his garments gorgeous and festive, glittering with gold, bloody red and purple, his mien heavy and silent. He was horribly changed and strange, but as yet undiscovered. In high waves, now mild, now stormy, the festivities went on around him. Warm glances of love caressed his face, still cold with the touch of the grave, and a friend's warm hand patted his bluish, heavy hand, and the music played joyous tunes mingled of the sounds of the tympanum, the pipe, the zither, and the dulcimer. It was as if bees were humming, locusts buzzing, and birds singing over the happy home of Mary and Martha. 2. Someone recklessly lifted the veil. By one breath of an uttered word, he destroyed the serene charm and uncovered the truth in its ugly nakedness. No thought was clearly defined in his mind when his lips smilingly asked, "Why do you not tell us, Lazarus? What was there?" And all became silent, struck with the question. Only now it seemed to have occurred to them that for 3 days Lazarus had been dead, and they looked with curiosity, awaiting an answer. But Lazarus remained silent. "You will not tell us?" wondered the inquirer. "Is it so terrible there?" Again his thought lagged behind his words. Had it preceded them, he would not have asked the question, for at the very moment he uttered it, his heart sank with a dread fear. All grew restless. They awaited the words of Lazarus anxiously. But he was silent, cold and severe, and his eyes were cast down. And now, as if for the first time, they perceived the horrible bluishness of his face and the loathsome corpulence of his body. On the table, as if forgotten by Lazarus, lay his livid blue hand, and all eyes were riveted upon it, as though expecting the desired answer from that hand. The musicians still played. Then silence fell upon them too, and the gay sounds died down, as scattered coals are extinguished by water. The pipe became mute, and the ringing tympanum, and the murmuring dulcimer. And as though a chord were broken, as though song itself were dying, the zither echoed a trembling, broken sound. Then all was quiet. "You will not," repeated the inquirer, unable to restrain his babbling tongue. Silence reigned, and the livid blue hand lay motionless. It moved slightly, and the company sighed with relief and raised their eyes. Lazarus, risen from the dead, was looking straight at them, embracing all with one glance, heavy and terrible. This was on the 3rd day after Lazarus had arisen from the grave. Since then, many had felt that his gaze was the gaze of destruction, but neither those who had been forever crushed by it, nor those who in the prime of life, mysterious even as death, had found the will to resist his glance, could ever explain the terror that lay immovable in the depths of his black pupils. He looked quiet and simple. One felt that he had no intention to hide anything, but also no intention to tell anything. His look was cold, as of one who is entirely indifferent to all that is alive. And many careless people who pressed around him and did not notice him later learned with wonder and fear the name of this stout, quiet man who brushed against them with his sumptuous, gaudy garments. The sun did not stop shining when he looked, neither did the fountain cease playing, and the eastern sky remained cloudless and blue as always. But the man who fell under his inscrutable gaze could no longer feel the sun, nor hear the fountain, nor recognize his native sky. Sometimes he would cry bitterly, sometimes tear his hair in despair and madly call for help. But generally it happened that the men thus stricken by the gaze of Lazarus began to fade away listlessly and quietly and pass into a slow death lasting many long years. They died in the presence of everybody, colourless, haggard and gloomy, like trees withering on rocky ground. Those who screamed in madness sometimes came back to life, but the others never. "So you will not tell us, Lazarus, what you saw there?" the inquirer repeated for the 3rd time. But now his voice was dull, and a dead, grey weariness looked stupidly from out his eyes. The faces of all present were also covered by the same dead, grey weariness like a mist. The guests stared at one another stupidly, not knowing why they had come together or why they sat around this rich table. They stopped talking and vaguely felt it was time to leave, but they could not overcome the lassitude that spread through their muscles. So they continued to sit there, each one isolated, like little dim lights scattered in the darkness of night. The musicians were paid to play, and they again took up the instruments, and again played gay or mournful airs. But it was music made to order, always the same tunes, and the guests listened wonderingly. Why was this music necessary, they thought? Why was it necessary, and what good did it do for people to pull at strings and blow their cheeks into thin pipes and produce varied and strange-sounding noises? "How badly they play," said someone. The musicians were insulted and left. Then the guests departed one by one, for it was nearing night. And when the quiet darkness enveloped them, and it became easier to breathe, the image of Lazarus suddenly arose before each one in stern splendor. There he stood, with the blue face of a corpse and the raiment of a bridegroom, sumptuous and resplendent, in his eyes that cold stare in the depths of which lurked the horrible. They stood still, as if turned into stone. The darkness surrounded them, and in the midst of this darkness flamed up the horrible apparition, the supernatural vision of the one who for 3 days had lain under the measureless power of death. 3 days he had been dead. Thrice had the sun risen and set, and he had lain dead. The children had played, the water had murmured as it streamed over the rocks, the hot dust had clouded the highway, and he had been dead. And now he was among men again, touched them, looked at them, looked at them. And through the black rings of his pupils, as through dark glasses, the unfathomable, there gazed upon humanity. 3. No one took care of Lazarus, and no friends or kindred remained with him. Only the great desert, enfolding the holy city, came close to the threshold of his abode. It entered his home and lay down on his couch like a spouse and put out all the fires. No one cared for Lazarus. One after the other went away, even his sisters, Mary and Martha. For a long while, Martha did not want to leave him, for she knew not who would nurse him or take care of him, and she cried and prayed. But one night, when the wind was roaming about the desert and the rustling cypress trees were bending over the roof, she dressed herself quietly and quietly went away. Lazarus probably heard how the door was slammed. It had not shut properly and the wind kept knocking it continually against the post, but he did not rise, did not go out, did not try to find out the reason. And the whole night until the morning, the cypress trees hissed over his head, and the door swung to and fro, allowing the cold, greedily prowling desert to enter his dwelling. Everybody shunned him as though he were a leper. They wanted to put a bell on his neck to avoid meeting him. But someone, turning pale, remarked it would be terrible if at night, under the windows, one should happen to hear Lazarus's bell, and all grew pale and assented. Since he did nothing for himself, he would probably have starved had not his neighbors, in trepidation, saved some food for him. Children brought it to him. They did not fear him, neither did they laugh at him in the innocent cruelty in which children often laugh at unfortunates. They were indifferent to him, and Lazarus showed the same indifference to them. He showed no desire to thank them for their services. He did not try to pat the dark hands and look into the simple, shining little eyes. Abandoned to the ravages of time and the desert, his house was falling to ruins, and his hungry, bleating goats had long been scattered among his neighbors. His wedding garments had grown old. He wore them without changing them, as he had donned them on that happy day when the musicians played. He did not see the difference between old and new, between torn and whole. The brilliant colors were burnt and faded. The vicious dogs of the city and the sharp thorns of the desert had rent the fine clothes to shreds. During the day, when the sun beat down mercilessly upon all living things, and even the scorpions hid under the stones, convulsed with a mad desire to sting, he sat motionless in the burning rays, lifting high his blue face and shaggy wild beard. While yet the people were unafraid to speak to him, same one had asked him, "Poor Lazarus, do you find it pleasant to sit so and look at the sun?" And he answered, "Yes, it is pleasant." The thought suggested itself to people that the cold of the 3 days in the grave had been so intense, its darkness so deep, that there was not in all the earth enough heat or light to warm Lazarus and lighten the gloom of his eyes, and inquirers turned away with a sigh. And when the setting sun, flat and purple-red descended to earth, Lazarus went into the desert and walked straight toward it, as though intending to reach it. Always he walked directly toward the sun, and those who tried to follow him and find out what he did at night in the desert had indelibly imprinted upon their mind's vision the black silhouette of a tall, stout man against the red background of an immense disk. The horrors of the night drove them away, and so they never found out what Lazarus did in the desert. But the image of the black form against the red was burned forever into their brains. Like an animal with a cinder in its eye, which furiously rubs its muzzle against its paws, they foolishly rubbed their eyes. But the impression left by Lazarus was ineffaceable, forgotten only in death. There were people living far away who never saw Lazarus and only heard of him. With an audacious curiosity which is stronger than fear and feeds on fear, with a secret sneer in their hearts, some of them came to him one day as he basked in the sun and entered into conversation with him. At that time, his appearance had changed for the better and was not so frightful. At first, the visitors snapped their fingers and thought disapprovingly of the foolish inhabitants of the holy city. But when the short talk came to an end and they went home, their expression was such that the inhabitants of the holy city at once knew their errand and said, "Here go some more madmen at whom Lazarus has looked." The speakers raised their hands in silent pity. Other visitors came, among them brave warriors in clinking armor who knew not fear, and happy youths who made merry with laughter and song. Busy merchants, jingling their coins, ran in for a while, and proud attendants at the temple placed their staffs at Lazarus's door. But no one returned the same as he came. A frightful shadow fell upon their souls and gave a new appearance to the old familiar world. Those who felt any desire to speak, after they had been stricken by the gaze of Lazarus, described the change that had come over them somewhat like this. All objects seen by the eye and palpable to the hand became empty, light, and transparent, as though they were light shadows in the darkness, and this darkness enveloped the whole universe. It was dispelled neither by the sun, nor by the moon, nor by the stars, but embraced the earth like a mother and clothed it in a boundless black veil. Into all bodies it penetrated, even into iron and stone, and the particles of the body lost their unity and became lonely. Even to the heart of the particles it penetrated, and the particles of the particles became lonely. The vast emptiness which surrounds the universe was not filled with things seen, with sun or moon or stars. It stretched boundless, penetrating everywhere, disuniting everything, body from body, particle from particle. In emptiness, the trees spread their roots, themselves empty. In emptiness rose phantom temples, palaces and houses, all empty. And in the emptiness moved restless man, himself empty and light, like a shadow. There was no more a sense of time. The beginning of all things and their end merged into one. In the very moment when a building was being erected and one could hear the builders striking with their hammers, one seemed already to see its ruins, and then emptiness where the ruins were. A man was just born, and funeral candles were already lighted at his head, and then were extinguished, and soon there was emptiness where before had been the man and the candles. And surrounded by darkness and empty waste, man trembled hopelessly before the dread of the infinite. So spoke those who had a desire to speak, but much more could probably have been told by those who did not want to talk and who died in silence. 4. At that time there lived in Rome a celebrated sculptor by the name of Aurelius. Out of clay, marble, and bronze, he created forms of gods and men of such beauty that this beauty was proclaimed immortal. But he himself was not satisfied, and said there was a supreme beauty that he had never succeeded in expressing in marble or bronze. "I have not yet gathered the radiance of the moon," he said. "I have not yet caught the glare of the sun. There is no soul in my marble. There is no life in my beautiful bronze. And when by moonlight he would slowly wander along the roads, crossing the black shadows of the cypress trees, his white tunic flashing in the moonlight, those he met used to laugh good-naturedly and say, "Is it moonlight that you are gathering, Aurelius? Why did you not bring some baskets along?" And he, too, would laugh and point to his eyes and say, "Here are the baskets in which I gather the light of the moon and the radiance of the sun." And that was the truth. In his eyes shone moon and sun. But he could not transmit the radiance to marble. Therein lay the greatest tragedy of his life. He was a descendant of an ancient race of patricians, had a good wife and children, and except in this one respect, lacked nothing. When the dark rumor about Lazarus reached him, he consulted his wife and friends and decided to make the long voyage to Judea in order that he might look upon the man miraculously raised from the dead. He felt lonely in those days and hoped on the way to renew his jaded energies. What they told him about Lazarus did not frighten him. He had meditated much upon death. He did not like it, nor did he like those who tried to harmonize it with life. On this side, beautiful life. On the other, mysterious death, he reasoned, and no better lot could befall a man than to live, to enjoy life and the beauty of living. And he already had conceived a desire to convince Lazarus of the truth of this view, and to return his soul to life, even as his body had been returned. This task did not appear impossible, for the reports about Lazarus, fearsome and strange as they were, did not tell the whole truth about him, but only carried a vague warning against something awful. Lazarus was getting up from a stone to follow in the path of the setting sun on the evening when the rich Roman, accompanied by an armed slave, approached him and in a ringing voice called to him, "Lazarus!" Lazarus saw a proud and beautiful face, made radiant by fame, and white garments and precious jewels shining in the sunlight. The ruddy rays of the sun lent to the head and face a likeness to dimly shining bronze. That was what Lazarus saw. He sank back to his seat obediently and wearily lowered his eyes. "It is true you are not beautiful, my poor Lazarus," said the Roman quietly, playing with his gold chain. "You are even frightful, my poor friend, and death was not lazy the day when you so carelessly fell into its arms. But you are as fat as a barrel, and fat people are not bad, as the great Caesar said. I do not understand why people are so afraid of you. You will permit me to stay with you overnight. It is already late, and I have no abode." Nobody had ever asked Lazarus to be allowed to pass the night with him. "I have no bed," said he. "I am somewhat of a warrior, and can sleep sitting," replied the Roman. "We shall make a light." "I have no light." "Then we will converse in the darkness like two friends. I suppose you have some wine." "I have no wine." The Roman laughed. "Now I understand why you are so gloomy and why you do not like your second life. No wine. Well, we shall do without. You know there are words that go to one's head, even as Falernian wine." With a motion of his head, he dismissed the slave, and they were alone. And again the sculptor spoke, but it seemed as though the sinking sun had penetrated into his words. They faded, pale and empty, as if trembling on weak feet, as if slipping and falling, drunk with the wine of anguish and despair. And black chasms appeared between the two men, like remote hints of vast emptiness and vast darkness. "Now I am your guest, and you will not ill-treat me, Lazarus," said the Roman. "Hospitality is binding even upon those who have been 3 days dead. 3 days, I am told, you were in the grave. It must have been cold there, and it is from there that you have brought this bad habit of doing without light and wine. I like a light. It gets dark so quickly here. Your eyebrows and forehead have an interesting line, even as the ruins of castles covered with the ashes of an earthquake. But why in such strange, ugly clothes? I have seen the bridegrooms of your country. They wear clothes like that, such ridiculous clothes, such awful garments. Are you a bridegroom?" Already the sun had disappeared. A gigantic black shadow was approaching fast from the west, as if prodigious bare feet were rustling over the sand, and the chill breezes stole up behind. In the darkness, you seem even bigger, Lazarus, as though you had grown stouter in these few minutes. Do you feed on darkness, perchance? And I would like a light, just a small light, just a small light. And I am cold. The nights here are so barbarously cold. If it were not so dark, I should say you were looking at me, Lazarus. Yes, it seems you are looking. You are looking. You are looking at me. I feel it. Now you are smiling. The night had come, and a heavy blackness filled the air. How good it will be when the sun rises again tomorrow. You know I am a great sculptor, so my friends call me. I create, yes, they say I create, but for that daylight is necessary. I give life to cold marble. I melt the ringing bronze in the fire, in a bright, hot fire. Why did you touch me with your hand? Come, said Lazarus, you are my guest. And they went into the house, and the shadows of the long evening fell on the earth. The slave at last grew tired waiting for his master, and when the sun stood high, he came to the house. And he saw, directly under its burning rays, Lazarus and his master sitting close together. They looked straight up and were silent. The slave wept and cried aloud, Master, what ails you, master? The same day Aurelius left for Rome. The whole way he was thoughtful and silent, attentively examining everything, the people, the ship, and the sea, as though endeavoring to recall something. On the sea, a great storm overtook them, and all the while Aurelius remained on deck and gazed eagerly at the approaching and falling waves. When he reached home, his family were shocked at the terrible change in his demeanor, but he calmed them with the words, I have found it. In the dusty clothes which he had worn during the entire journey and had not changed, he began his work, and the marble ringingly responded to the resounding blows of the hammer. Long and eagerly he worked, admitting no one. At last, one morning, he announced that the work was ready, and gave instructions that all his friends and the severe critics and judges of art be called together. Then he donned gorgeous garments, shining with gold, glowing with the purple of the bison. Here is what I have created, he said thoughtfully. His friends looked, and immediately the shadow of deep sorrow covered their faces. It was a thing monstrous, possessing none of the forms familiar to the eye, yet not devoid of a hint of some new, unknown form. On a thin, tortuous little branch, or rather an ugly likeness of one, lay crooked, strange, unsightly, shapeless heaps of something turned outside in, or something turned inside out, wild fragments which seemed to be feebly trying to get away from themselves. And, accidentally, under one of the wild projections, they noticed a wonderfully sculptured butterfly with transparent wings, trembling as though with a weak longing to fly. Why that wonderful butterfly, Aurelius? Timidly asked someone. I do not know, answered the sculptor. The truth had to be told, and one of his friends, the one who loved Aurelius best, said, This is ugly, my poor friend. It must be destroyed. Give me the hammer. And with 2 blows he destroyed the monstrous mass, leaving only the wonderfully sculptured butterfly. After that, Aurelius created nothing. He looked with absolute indifference at marble and at bronze and at his own divine creations, in which dwelt immortal beauty. In the hope of breathing into him once again the old flame of inspiration, with the idea of awakening his dead soul, his friends led him to see the beautiful creations of others, but he remained indifferent, and no smile warmed his closed lips. And only after they spoke to him much and long of beauty, he would reply wearily, But all this is a lie. And in the daytime, when the sun was shining, he would go into his rich and beautifully laid-out garden, and finding a place where there was no shadow, would expose his bare head and his dull eyes to the glitter and burning heat of the sun. Red and white butterflies fluttered around. Down into the marble cistern ran splashing water from the crooked mouth of a blissfully drunken satyr. But he sat motionless, like a pale shadow of that other one who, in a far land, at the very gates of the stony desert, also sat motionless under the fiery sun. 5. And it came about finally that Lazarus was summoned to Rome by the great Augustus. They dressed him in gorgeous garments, as though it had been ordained that he was to remain a bridegroom to an unknown bride until the very day of his death. It was as if an old coffin, rotten and falling apart, were regilded over and over, and gay tassels were hung on it. And solemnly they conducted him in gala attire, as though in truth it were a bridal procession, the runners loudly sounding the trumpet that the way be made for the ambassadors of the emperor. But the roads along which he passed were deserted. His entire native land cursed the execrable name of Lazarus, the man miraculously brought to life, and the people scattered at the mere report of his horrible approach. The trumpeters blew lonely blasts, and only the desert answered with a dying echo. Then they carried him across the sea on the saddest and most gorgeous ship that was ever mirrored in the azure waves of the Mediterranean. There were many people aboard, but the ship was silent and still as a coffin, and the water seemed to moan as it parted before the short, curved prow. Lazarus sat lonely, baring his head to the sun, and listening in silence to the splashing of the waters. Further away, the seamen and the ambassadors gathered like a crowd of distressed shadows. If a thunderstorm had happened to burst upon them at that time, or the wind had overwhelmed the red sails, the ship would probably have perished, for none of those who were on her had strength or desire enough to fight for life. With supreme effort, some went to the side of the ship and eagerly gazed at the blue, transparent abyss. Perhaps they imagined they saw a naiad flashing a pink shoulder through the waves, or an insanely joyous and drunken centaur galloping by, splashing up the water with his hoofs. But the sea was deserted and mute, and so was the watery abyss. Listlessly, Lazarus set foot on the streets of the eternal city, as though all its riches, all the majesty of its gigantic edifices, all the luster and beauty and music of refined life were simply the echo of the wind in the desert, or the misty images of hot running sand. Chariots whirled by. The crowd of strong, beautiful, haughty men passed on, builders of the eternal city and proud partakers of its life. Songs rang out, fountains laughed, pearly laughter of women filled the air, while the drunkard philosophized and the sober ones smilingly listened. Horseshoes rattled on the pavement, and surrounded on all sides by glad sounds, a fat, heavy man moved through the center of the city like a cold spot of silence, sowing in his path grief, anger, and vague, carking distress. Who dared to be sad in Rome? Indignantly demanded frowning citizens. And in 2 days the swift-tongued Rome knew of Lazarus, the man miraculously raised from the grave, and timidly evaded him. There were many brave men ready to try their strength, and at their senseless call Lazarus came obediently. The emperor was so engrossed with state affairs that he delayed receiving the visitor, and for 7 days Lazarus moved among the people. A jovial drunkard met him with a smile on his red lips. "Drink, Lazarus, drink," he cried. "Would not Augustus laugh to see you drink?" And naked, besotted women laughed and decked the blue hands of Lazarus with rose leaves. But the drunkard looked into the eyes of Lazarus, and his joy ended forever. Thereafter he was always drunk. He drank no more, but was drunk all the time, shadowed by fearful dreams instead of the joyous reveries that wine gives. Fearful dreams became the food of his broken spirit. Fearful dreams held him day and night in the mists of monstrous fantasy, and death itself was no more fearful than the apparition of its fierce precursor. Lazarus came to a youth and his lass who loved each other and were beautiful in their love. Proudly and strongly holding in his arms his beloved one, the youth said with gentle pity, "Look at us, Lazarus, and rejoice with us. Is there anything stronger than love?" And Lazarus looked at them, and their whole life they continued to love one another, but their love became mournful and gloomy, even as those cypress trees over the tombs that feed their roots on the putrescence of the grave and strive in vain in the quiet evening hour to touch the sky with their pointed tops. Hurled by fathomless life forces into each other's arms, they mingled their kisses with tears, their joy with pain, and only succeeded in realizing the more vividly a sense of their slavery to the silent nothing. Forever united, forever parted, they flashed like sparks, and like sparks went out in boundless darkness. Lazarus came to a proud sage, and the sage said to him, "I already know all the horrors that you may tell me, Lazarus. With what else can you terrify me?" Only a few moments passed before the sage realized that the knowledge of the horrible is not the horrible, and that the sight of death is not death. And he felt that in the eyes of the infinite, wisdom and folly are the same, for the infinite knows them not, and the boundaries between knowledge and ignorance, between truth and falsehood, between top and bottom, faded, and his shapeless thought was suspended in emptiness. Then he grasped his grey head in his hands and cried out insanely, "I cannot think! I cannot think!" Thus it was that under the cool gaze of Lazarus, the man miraculously raised from the dead, all that serves to affirm life, its sense and its joys, perished. And people began to say it was dangerous to allow him to see the emperor, that it were better to kill him and bury him secretly and swear he had disappeared. Swords were sharpened, and youths devoted to the welfare of the people announced their readiness to become assassins when Augustus upset the cruel plans by demanding that Lazarus appear before him. Even though Lazarus could not be kept away, it was felt that the heavy impression conveyed by his face might be somewhat softened. With that end in view, expert painters, barbers, and artists were secured who worked the whole night on Lazarus's head. His beard was trimmed and curled. The disagreeable and deadly bluishness of his hands and face was covered up with paint. His hands were whitened, his cheeks rouged. The disgusting wrinkles of suffering that ridged his old face were patched up and painted, and on the smooth surface, wrinkles of good nature and laughter, and of pleasant, good-humoured cheeriness, were laid on artistically with fine brushes. Lazarus submitted indifferently to all they did with him, and soon was transformed into a stout, nice-looking old man, for all the world a quiet and good-humoured grandfather of numerous grandchildren. He looked as though the smile with which he told funny stories had not left his lips, as though a quiet tenderness still lay hidden in the corner of his eyes. But the wedding dress they did not dare to take off, and they could not change his eyes, the dark, terrible eyes from out of which stared the incomprehensible there. 6. Lazarus was untouched by the magnificence of the imperial apartments. He remained stolidly indifferent, as though he saw no contrast between his ruined house at the edge of the desert and the solid, beautiful palace of stone. Under his feet, the hard marble of the floor took on the semblance of the moving sands of the desert, and to his eyes, the throngs of gaily dressed, haughty men were as unreal as the emptiness of the air. They looked not into his face as he passed by, fearing to come under the awful bane of his eyes, but when the sound of his heavy steps announced that he had passed, heads were lifted, and eyes examined with timid curiosity the figure of the corpulent, tall, slightly stooping old man as he slowly passed into the heart of the imperial palace. If death itself had appeared, men would not have feared it so much, for hitherto death had been known to the dead only, and life to the living only, and between these two there had been no bridge. But this strange being knew death, and that knowledge of his was felt to be mysterious and cursed. "He will kill our great divine Augustus," men cried with horror, and they hurled curses after him. Slowly and stolidly he passed them by, penetrating ever deeper into the palace. Caesar knew already who Lazarus was, and was prepared to meet him. He was a courageous man. He felt his power was invincible, and in the fateful encounter with the man, wonderfully raised from the dead, he refused to lean on other men's weak help. Man to man, face to face, he met Lazarus, "Do not fix your gaze on me, Lazarus," he commanded. "I have heard that your head is like the head of Medusa and turns into stone all upon whom you look, but I should like to have a close look at you and to talk to you before I turn into stone," he added in a spirit of playfulness that concealed his real misgivings. Approaching him, he examined closely Lazarus's face and his strange, festive clothes. Though his eyes were sharp and keen, he was deceived by the skilful counterfeit. "Well, your appearance is not terrible, venerable sir, but all the worse for men when the terrible takes on such a venerable and pleasant appearance. Now let us talk." Augustus sat down, and as much by glance as by words began the discussion. "Why did you not salute me when you entered?" Lazarus answered indifferently, "I did not know it was necessary." "You are a Christian?" "No." Augustus nodded approvingly. "That is good. I do not like the Christians. They shake the tree of life, forbidding it to bear fruit, and they scatter to the wind its fragrant blossoms. But who are you?" With some effort, Lazarus answered, "I was dead." "I heard about that. But who are you now?" Lazarus's answer came slowly. Finally he said again, listlessly and indistinctly, "I was dead." "Listen to me, stranger," said the emperor sharply, giving expression to what had been in his mind before. "My empire is an empire of the living. My people are a people of the living, and not of the dead. You are superfluous here. I do not know who you are. I do not know what you have seen there. But if you lie, I hate your lies, and if you tell the truth, I hate your truth. In my heart I feel the pulse of life. In my hands I feel power, and my proud thoughts, like eagles, fly through space. Behind my back, under the protection of my authority, under the shadow of the laws I have created, men live and labor and rejoice. Do you hear this divine harmony of life? Do you hear the war cry that men hurl into the face of the future, challenging it to strife?" Augustus extended his arms reverently and solemnly cried out, "Blessed art thou, great divine life." But Lazarus was silent, and the emperor continued more severely, "You are not wanted here. Pitiful remnant, half devoured of death, you fill men with distress and aversion to life. Like a caterpillar on the fields, you are gnawing away at the full seed of joy, exuding the slime of despair and sorrow. Your truth is like a rusted sword in the hands of a night assassin, and I shall condemn you to death as an assassin. But first, I want to look into your eyes. Mayhap only cowards fear them, and brave men are spurred on to struggle and victory. Then will you merit not death, but a reward. Look at me, Lazarus." At first it seemed to divine Augustus as if a friend were looking at him, so soft, so alluring, so gently fascinating was the gaze of Lazarus. It promised not horror but quiet rest, and the infinite dwelt there as a fond mistress, a compassionate sister, a mother. And ever stronger grew its gentle embrace, until he felt, as it were, the breath of a mouth hungry for kisses. Then it seemed as if iron bones protruded in a ravenous grip and closed upon him in an iron band, and cold nails touched his heart and slowly, slowly sank into it. "It pains me," said divine Augustus, growing pale. "But look, Lazarus, look." Ponderous gates, shutting off eternity, appeared to be slowly swinging open, and through the growing aperture poured in, coldly and calmly, the awful horror of the infinite. Boundless emptiness and boundless gloom entered like two shadows, extinguishing the sun, removing the ground from under the feet, and the cover from over the head. And the pain in his icy heart ceased. "Look at me! Look at me, Lazarus!" commanded Augustus, staggering. Time ceased, and the beginning of things came perilously near to the end. The throne of Augustus, so recently erected, fell to pieces, and emptiness took the place of the throne and of Augustus. Rome fell silently into ruins. A new city rose in its place, and it too was erased by emptiness. Like phantom giants, cities, Kingdoms and countries swiftly fell and disappeared into emptiness, swallowed up in the black maw of the infinite. "Cease!" commanded the emperor. Already the accent of indifference was in his voice. His arms hung powerless, and his eagle eyes flashed and were dimmed again, struggling against overwhelming darkness. "You have killed me, Lazarus," he said drowsily. These words of despair saved him. He thought of the people whose shield he was destined to be, and a sharp, redeeming pang pierced his dull heart. He thought of them doomed to perish, and he was filled with anguish. First, they seemed bright shadows in the gloom of the infinite. How terrible! Then they appeared as fragile vessels with life-agitated blood and hearts that knew both sorrow and great joy. And he thought of them with tenderness, and so thinking and feeling, inclining the scales now to the side of life, now to the side of death, he slowly returned to life, to find in its suffering and joy a refuge from the gloom, emptiness, and fear of the infinite. "No, you did not kill me, Lazarus," said he firmly, "but I will kill you. Go!" Evening came, and divine Augustus partook of food and drink with great joy. But there were moments when his raised arm would remain suspended in the air, and the light of his shining, eager eyes was dimmed. It seemed as if an icy wave of horror washed against his feet. He was vanquished, but not killed, and coldly awaited his doom, like a black shadow. His nights were haunted by horror, but the bright days still brought him the joys, as well as the sorrows of life. Next day, by order of the emperor, they burned out Lazarus's eyes with hot irons and sent him home. Even Augustus dared not kill him. Lazarus returned to the desert, and the desert received him with the breath of the hissing wind and the ardor of the glowing sun. Again he sat on the stone with matted beard uplifted, and two black holes where the eyes had once been looked dull and horrible at the sky. In the distance the holy city surged and roared restlessly, but near him all was deserted and still. No one approached the place where Lazarus, miraculously raised from the dead, passed his last days, for his neighbors had long since abandoned their homes. His cursed knowledge, driven by the hot irons from his eyes deep into the brain, lay there in ambush. As if from ambush it might spring out upon men with 1,000 unseen eyes. No one dared to look at Lazarus, and in the evening, when the sun, swollen crimson and growing larger, bent its way toward the west, blind Lazarus slowly groped after it. He stumbled against stones and fell. Corpulent and feeble, he rose heavily and walked on. And against the red curtain of sunset, his dark form and outstretched arms gave him the semblance of a cross. It happened once that he went and never returned. Thus ended the second life of Lazarus, who for 3 days had been in the mysterious thraldom of death, and then was miraculously raised from the dead.